Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our special World Gorilla Day presentation. My name is Marianne Hunt, and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel in the Office of Alumni Engagement. One of our goals is to engage our community in the intellectual life of the university, and in this case, one of our world-class professional schools, the Cummings School for Veterinary Medicine, through faculty presentations like this and our international group travel program. I'm very pleased to welcome over 100 alumni, parents, and friends of Tufts to this event from around the globe to this special presentation in honor of World Gorilla Day. First launched in 2017, World Gorilla Day is an animal awareness day geared towards celebrating gorillas and empowering global communities to take action for their conservation. And the first step towards action and conservation is education. When I first heard of this day, my mind immediately went to Professors Felicia Nutter and Chris Whittier from the Cummings School. But before I introduce them, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that your audio and video has been turned off to eliminate any distraction and disruption from background noise. We'll have an audience Q&A session after the presentation, and if you'd like to ask a question, and I encourage you to do so, please use the Q&A chat feature at the lower right-hand portion of your screen. This webinar will be recorded, and we will upload it to the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. My colleague Jabari will post the link to that page in the chat box now, and you'll receive an email when the video is ready for viewing. And while you're there, I encourage you to check out some of our other great content. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our community values. Our goal is to create an environment where everybody feels welcome to ask questions and participate in respectful conversation. And Jabari is now going to post those values in the chat too. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Professors Nutter and Whittier. Professor Felicia Nutter has held leadership roles in the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats Program, focused on the development of curriculum and learning opportunities to support teaching and learning about One Health in multiple countries across Africa and Southeast Asia. She mentors veterinary students interested in exploring research and service projects, as well as clinical rotations in other countries. Professor Whittier directs the Conservation Medicine program at the Cummings School. He is interested in issues of wildlife health with a specific emphasis on human infectious disease threats to wildlife. And as an avid wildlife photographer, his work has appeared in a number of wildlife documentaries, and he has had field and laboratory research and photographs published in a variety of scientific journals, magazines, and books. Together, they have been studying, working, and conducting research in Africa since 1989, and have traveled throughout the continent and lived in Tanzania and Rwanda. They were veterinarians for the mountain gorillas in the early 2000s, and in addition to providing veterinary care for wild gorillas, also conducted research, trained veterinarians and students, and helped build employee health programs and the first sanctuaries for confiscated gorillas in that region of Africa. I've had the pleasure of getting to know them through our work together on the Travel Learn program, and have come to admire their enthusiasm and dedication to conservation and their research, as well as their commitment to teaching, and not just their students, but also to our alumni family. So with that, I'd like to have everyone join me and give a warm virtual welcome to Professors Felicia Nutter and Chris Whittier.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It's a pleasure for us to be able to talk about gorillas today, and want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. What we're aiming to do today is to talk a little bit about just kind of some basics about gorillas. So we're going to give you a little bit of a course that we'll call Gorillas 101. So just some of the basic information about gorillas, and talk about their threats, the threats to their conservation, kind of woven in a little bit with just the basic information about them. And then I'm going to turn it over to Felicia, who's going to talk a little bit about veterinary medicine as an applied tool that's aided towards their conservation. And finally, we're going to wrap up with a couple of things that we can all be doing in terms of helping to protect gorillas and contribute to their conservation. I wanted to start though just by giving a quick shout out to our friend and colleague, Tara Stawinski, who is actually a Tufts alum. If you can read the writing there, there's a little mention of Tufts in her blurb with the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. She was hoping to join us today for a quick introduction, but she's actually lucky to be in the field in Rwanda right now, so we're unable to coordinate that. But we've been working with her for many years, and just wanted to point out that she's another excellent Tufts affiliation with the mountain gorillas in that region. So I want to start off by just kind of talking a little bit about, why we or why anybody should care about gorillas. And, I think that, this is something that Felicia and I talk about quite a bit and sort of think about, what are the sort of scientific arguments and what are the kind of emotional and sort of other arguments or reasons that sort of to connect with people. And from a scientific standpoint, gorillas are what we consider to be both a flagship and a keystone species. And by that, we mean that they are sort of the high profile animals in the environment that they live in, and helping to protect them, helps to protect a whole lot of other animals and the habitat that they live in. So it's a picture of some of the forest in Rwanda that you can hopefully appreciate the sort of beauty of being one of the really unique places. But within that forest, there's also lots of other animals. So, both the sort of high profile mammals that we might recognize, but also, lots of animals that are sort of less appreciated in terms of their contribution to everything, but they're important parts of the biodiversity of this ecosystem. And there's really, quite a magnificence of animals in the parks that gorillas inhabit, both in Eastern Africa and the Eastern gorillas and in the West as well. And so there's a really important argument for gorillas just as important part of the biodiversity in these habitats. But I think that the other thing is that just sort of the emotional attachment that, we all tend to have for gorillas. The fact that, so many of you have chosen to join us today, I think speaks to this connection, that we feel. And so obviously, gorillas are one of our, the closest of our kin in the animal kingdom. They look like us, they act like us in some ways. And so there are a lot of things that help us to, sort of connect with them on an emotional level. And so I think that there's a lot of that sort of value that I think everybody just sort of appreciates, and that there are certain animals that we connect with. And that doesn't mean that we don't, appreciate the value of all animals and plants and other things as well. But there are sort of, special animals that we tend to connect with. And I think, gorillas fit into that category. The other thing, the reason that we should care about gorillas is that we're also sort of responsible for, their current plight. So here's a picture of silverback who's wandered a little bit outside of the national park. So obviously you can see he's out in these, open fields in Rwanda, and you can see the volcanic mountains in the background. So that's the other side, the rest of the park that kind of wraps around in this picture. But where this gorilla is standing is actually sort of former habitat for these gorillas. And so, this is an area that was cut down and deforested in the 60s and 70s in order to grow those little white flowers that you can see there that are grown as an insecticide. So it's very likely that in the lifetime of this gorilla, where he's standing right now, was originally a forest. And so, I think this is I show this just as a reminder that, the plight of gorillas, like most wildlife, is very much affected by things that we as people have done to the environment in terms of, the restricting their habitat and doing other things that we'll talk a little bit more about. So, so to back up a bit and just make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we talk about gorillas, primatologists, always get really upset when anybody refers to gorillas or chimpanzees as monkeys. And so the first distinction I want to make is that we're all clear about this sort of idea and distinction between monkeys and apes. And the easiest thing, if you're not familiar with this, is to recognize that by and large, almost all monkeys have tails, and no apes have tails. And so that's sort of the easy way of distinguishing between the two different types. But taxonomically, there's sort of a division that we recognize, as this diagram shows, with the prosimians, and then New World monkeys that we might find in South America, and then the Old World monkeys that we'll find in Africa and Asia, and then the great apes as being a branch from there, and the sort of those biggest of the primate species. So we talk about African apes. We currently recognize them in 2 different genera or genuses, 4 different species, and 9 different taxa. And so I don't want to give you too much of a taxonomy lesson, but I think it's important that we all sort of think about where these animals sort of fit into the scheme of the animal kingdom. So most people are familiar with chimpanzees. You're probably not aware that chimpanzees are sort of currently recognized as 4 different subspecies, 3 of which are endangered and 1 is critically endangered. And then bonobos are animals that most people are not familiar with, and we used to refer to them as pygmy chimpanzees, but they're actually not really any smaller, and there are obvious connotations to using the word pygmy. But these are a species that's isolated to Democratic Republic of Congo, and they're also endangered. And then what a lot of people also don't realize is that gorillas, there's actually two different species of gorillas. And so we have the Western gorillas that are also divided further into two different subspecies, both critically endangered. And then the Eastern gorillas, which is most of what we'll talk about today, that are also divided into two subspecies, one that's endangered and one that's critically endangered. And part of what we'll talk about in the next couple of slides, and that hopefully Felicia will drive home, is that these populations actually used to both be critically endangered. And the mountain gorillas have actually recently been upgraded to being only endangered. And endangered is obviously bad, but it's better than being critically endangered. So, I always say that thinking about the two different species, you can sort of draw a line down the middle of Africa and have Eastern gorillas in the east and Western gorillas in the west. And so here's a map showing the different subspecies and their ranges across Africa. And so we're going to focus, most of what we'll talk about today in the sort of the green arrow that's pointing to that small maroon area, which is the habitat where the mountain gorillas are. But just to kind of compare for a second, the mountain gorilla subspecies and the Western lowland gorilla species. The mountain gorillas, there are currently about 1,000. This is a number that's going up, which is fantastic news and part of the reason that they're no longer considered critically endangered. Whereas the Western lowland gorillas, there really are not very good estimates about how many remain. It's somewhere between 100 and maybe 200, maybe even 300,000. But their populations are declining very rapidly, which is part of why they're considered critically endangered, as opposed to endangered for the mountain gorillas. The other important thing about this is that the majority of the mountain gorillas are habituated. And what that means is that over years of researchers and veterinarians and park rangers and now tourists working with them, the mountain gorillas, most of these mountain gorillas have basically learned to tolerate people coming into their habitat to study them and to take pictures and basically to visit them. And so they're not really tame by any means. It's just that they've gotten used to people coming there, so they don't run away, even though that would be their natural instinct. The Western lowland gorillas, on the other hand, there's only a few groups of those that are at all habituated, meaning that researchers can go and follow them and find them every day and or go and visit them. And so part of what that also means is that there's a huge economic incentive that's driving the protection of the mountain gorillas that's really based on the dollars that come in for tourism. So tourism is part of the really important equation that's contributing to the sort of benefit of mountain gorillas and also their habitat. Whereas with the Western lowland gorillas, because of partly where they live, but the fact that there's also many fewer of them that are habituated to be visited, there's not nearly the same kind of revenue or economic incentive to be protecting them. And that's part of the reason that the Western population is declining so rapidly. So if we look at the population of gorillas across all of Africa, I always point out that essentially you could fit all of these gorillas in a big football stadium. That's the sort of extent of the whole global population of gorillas that we're talking about. And the mountain gorillas, which again we'll focus on for most of this, are numbering around 1,000. I actually just looked up yesterday, and the freshman class at Tufts this incoming year is about 1,800. So there are more Tufts freshmen. It's actually almost 2 to 1 for the Tufts freshman class for this year, as there are mountain gorillas remaining in the wild. So again, just to put those numbers into some perspective. So focusing in on the mountain gorilla population, as you can see here, there's the two dark green areas are the habitats that remain for the mountain gorilla population, is sort of divided into these two different ranges, and most of what we'll talk about are the gorillas that live in the southern part, but these are disconnected habitats. So as you can see, these are this is a Google map, this is a satellite image, and you can appreciate that essentially, these green islands that these gorillas are living in are the sort of remaining forests in these areas compared to the kind of surrounding areas that are generally all pretty well cultivated. If you focus in on this a little bit more on the sort of southern range, again, I'm always sort of amazed looking at this picture and realizing that the sort of stark differences that you can, appreciate with the, gorillas being sort of in this sort of green habitat versus, walking outside, like in the picture that I showed you earlier, and being in, and essentially, they might as well be in the middle of cornfields in the Midwestern US in terms of, what that habitat looks like. So there's a very small amount of space that's still remaining to protect these gorillas. Just a couple of quick distinctions between the mountain gorillas and the Western gorillas again. So obviously the mountain gorillas are called mountain gorillas because they live in the mountains. And so these are all sort of former and now dormant volcanoes. There's actually, if you pay attention at all to the news in Africa, the actually most active volcano in Africa is the active one at the end of this chain, which is fortunately just outside of the gorilla habitat. But the rest of these volcanoes have been formed as part of that same chain. So this is high altitude. One of the mountains in this range, I think, is the third highest in Africa. So the gorillas actually go up to these very, very high altitudes. It's very different with the Western lowland gorillas. And so they live in the sort of tropical, what's generally referred to as the Congo Basin. And the picture that I show on the left is a little bit deceptive because there are these open areas where we can see gorillas that, in these sort of open meadows or open fields. But generally the gorillas are in the forest and kind of the background of that picture, which is a really intense, pretty thick forest. Low elevation, really high humidity, much warmer temperature. So it's a very, very different habitat. And part of what that means is that the Western gorillas and the mountain gorillas have also, evolved to be in those habitats. And so, so if you were students, I would quiz you right now on what you might appreciate between these two different pictures of the different gorillas. But what you should recognize is the first thing is the difference in their hair coats. So the mountain gorillas on the right are sort of shaggier fur, as you would expect, living in the colder environment. They're also a little bit bigger, and so thermodynamically, if you're a little bit bigger and you're a little bit rounder, that means that you can retain your body heat a little bit more. So that also serves the mountain gorillas being a little bit bigger and furrier to be able to keep their heat a little bit. And then the other sort of physical difference that I think is relatively obvious in this picture is that the Western lowland gorillas, and again, the dominant males are pretty prominent in these pictures, but the male on the left, you can see that most of his forehead is a little bit sort of brownish or reddish, and that's a trait that tends to be reserved for the Western gorillas. So gorillas, whether we're talking about Western or Eastern gorillas, gorillas are social primates, so they do live in family groups. And those family groups can be as small as a couple of gorillas to as big as more than 50. When we left Rwanda in 2006, there was a gorilla group that was approaching 70 at the time, which was extraordinary and actually ended up kind of splitting up and fracturing into multiple different groups. So they, groups can be sort of various sizes. It's more typical to kind of be 10 to 20. And part of what that means is that you can have groups where you've got multiple adult males. So the adult males are, the sort of dominant structure within a gorilla group is that no matter how many males you have, there will be one who is the dominant male. And then oftentimes part of their behavior means that the other males are trying to jockey and fight for position to be able to be, overtaking the dominant male or to take over the group. But there is a structure within them, and very often they might be related to each other, but you can have groups where you have 4 or 5 or even 6 adult males in a group, and that can be pretty dynamic just because there's a lot of interaction between them. But the females are really the sort of bread and butter that holds the group together. I'll come back to that in a second. But so this is, again, sort of an appreciation for how big they are. So adult male gorilla can be around 400 pounds. Females are a little bit smaller, or quite a bit smaller. It can be about half the size, and so about 200 pounds is a good size adult female. And the babies are born sort of 3 or 4 pounds, so they're relatively small. So this is, I'm always amazed at these pictures of the sort of, baby gorillas that are about the size of the silverback gorilla's head. And so, gorillas like this, very easy to tell them apart. Some other gorillas are much more difficult to tell apart. So, the 2 gorillas in these pictures, you should be able to appreciate they're sort of about the same size. There aren't really any sort of obvious distinguishing features between them. But the way that we identify them individually in the wild, unless you work with them every day and you can sort of pick up some of those behaviors, is to actually look at their wrinkles in their noses. So these are close-ups of a couple of gorillas, and you should be able to appreciate that they have a very distinctive sort of line structure within their nose. So you can make little diagrams, of these, and then have kind of a cheat sheet where you then have what is essentially a fingerprint for individual gorillas. So we refer to this as a nose print, and these are very distinctive in the mountain gorillas. They're much more subtle in the Western gorillas, but these, serve a really useful purpose for us, particularly as veterinarians, and trying to distinguish between different individual gorillas. So as I said earlier, the males, the adult males, the silverbacks get a lot of the attention, but it's really the females that are the glue that hold the groups together. And so females generally, they start to be reproductive around 7 or 8 years old, and they usually don't produce offspring any more frequently than about every 5 years. So they stay with their, babies until they grow to be about 4 or 5 years old before they even start to reproduce again. The picture on the left, even though it looks like a chimpanzee, that is a baby mountain gorilla. And so some of them are born with this really light colored skin that will turn black in the first couple weeks or months. And the picture on the right, those are twins. And so mountain gorillas, like any primates, do occasionally have twins. Historically, with mountain gorillas, the twins have never both survived to adulthood until this pair that you see in the picture here. So this is the first pair that have both reached. I think they're about 12 or 13 years old now, and they're the first pair that have both gotten to be that old. And that's because it's generally pretty challenging for an adult female gorilla to be able to produce enough milk to sustain both baby gorillas. So oftentimes one of them ends up out competing the other. The other sort of kind of last point of your sort of gorilla 101 is that gorillas are relatively strict vegetarians. And so gorillas eat, depending on the habitat, a couple hundreds different kinds of plants. There are sort of 5 to 10 things that tend to be the staple or the bulk of their diet, but they're exclusively plant eaters, with one exception. And the one exception is that they do occasionally eat insects, both accidentally and deliberately. And so this is a screen capture from a video of a young mountain gorilla. If you can appreciate them sticking her hand into the ground to basically pull out a handful of dirt that's got some ants or termites in it. And this is actually a relatively rare thing that I've only ever seen a couple of times with mountain gorillas. But the Western lowland gorillas, on the other hand, actually eat a lot of insects. And so this is a picture of a Western lowland gorilla. Again, you should be able to appreciate the difference in the hair coat that's eating, breaking off a piece of a termite mound from a tree to be able to eat the termites from there. So it's actually very common for the Western gorillas to eat termites and other insects. So as I alluded to earlier, habitat loss tends to be one of the big threats to gorillas. But another is poaching, which Felicia may talk a little bit more about in a second in terms of the sort of health implications. And there are different kinds of poaching, both the sort of accidental and deliberate poaching, including the trade and trying to capture baby gorillas for the pet trade, which is of course illegal, but does impact their populations. And then, the other big threat to gorillas currently is infectious disease. And so, us as veterinarians, this is an important part of our work and why we've been involved in what we've done. So I'm going to stop here, and Felicia will take over to tell you a little bit more about the veterinary work.
All right, thank you, Chris. Okay, can everybody see my slides okay? Yes, okay, great. I want to take kind of a step back a little bit, like Chris said, and just kind of explain a little bit more about the organization that we worked for when we worked with mountain gorillas, and also something that many of you may be aware of, Dian Fossey's work and how they're related. So this is a picture of Dian Fossey from shortly after she arrived in Rwanda. She was originally supposed to start work in Uganda, but because of security issues, I'm sorry, in Congo, but because of security issues, she moved her project to Rwanda. And the Karasoke Research Center was established in 1967, September of 1967. So I'm going to age myself, but that was a month before I was born. And it was named for the area between Karisimbi and Visoki volcanoes where the camp was constructed. So Dian was one of the Leaky ladies, along with Jane Goodall studying chimpanzees and Baruti Galdikas studying orangutans in Indonesia, sent to the field by Louis Leakey to observe our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, the great apes. And Dian, I will say personally, Dian and Jane's presence in National Geographic magazines and on television shows were really an integral part of my sort of childhood and a core inspiration for my career path. And I am ever thankful for the example set by these two amazingly strong women. So Diane worked not only to understand gorilla behavior, which was sort of her primary purpose for being there, but also to understand the threats to their continued existence. So here's a picture of Diane taken by Bob Campbell, a National Geographic photographer, inside the park early in her time there. And those are Ankole cattle that are grazing inside the park. And this is a protected area, but that protection really largely existed only on paper. And having cattle grazing inside what's supposed to be a protected area or a national park system causes damage to the plants and also damage to the ecosystem and the other animals that are there. So the habitat was significantly degraded because of these large cattle herds. Chris showed a similar photo of a gorilla and kind of changing habitats. When Diane arrived, she also saw that forest was being converted both legally and illegally into farmland. So you can see in the top left of this picture, there's a very hard border between the national park, the protected area, and the farm fields. And in the living memory, like Chris said, of that gorilla, some of that farm field has previously been protected area. So that's a gorilla that might have gone somewhere that's now farm field to consume bamboo or other high value plants and now can't go there anymore. And of course, poaching to supply pet market and also weird trinkets, what we think of now as weird trinkets, ashtrays made out of gorilla hands and feet, which is sort of unimaginable now. But that was something that was marketed to tourists in the region at that time. This is a more recent photo of a rope snare, but metal cable snares are also increasingly common and they do more severe damage more quickly. So gorillas were dying from infection, from gangrene, or being permanently maimed, losing hands and feet or parts of limbs if they survived that original injury. So the idea for what was called the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, and is now called the Gorilla Doctors in part, was really born in 1984 when Diane Fossey made a request to her friend Ruth Morris Kiesling. And Ruth was the daughter of Dr. Mark Morris, a veterinarian who established the Morris Animal Foundation from the profits with Hill's Science Diet pet foods, which some of you might buy and use for your own pets. We do as well. So the commitment to establish the project was made in 1985. Diane made a very convincing pitch to her friend, who made a very convincing pitch to her father. And Dr. James Foster, who was the first veterinarian that worked with the mountain gorillas, was set to arrive in 1986. Unfortunately, Diane died just a few weeks before he arrived to start his work. But the work with veterinarians providing direct care to mountain gorillas is part of Diane's incredible legacy. For the first several years that veterinarians worked with the mountain gorillas, they were largely zoo veterinarians that took sort of temporary leaves of absence, maybe 3 to 6 months up to a year from a job at a zoo. And that's because these are the folks that had experience working with these animals. And we're trying to take that experience working with the animals in captivity and figure out how in the world do you safely for the animals and the people involved anesthetize a mountain gorilla in the wild to remove a snare, to treat an injury. So that was part of the work of those first veterinarians who were really incredibly brave, groundbreaking pioneers to do that kind of work. The position evolved over time to be full-time jobs and full-time multi-year rotations. So the project started in Rwanda and has expanded to cover all mountain gorilla range countries. So Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And at the time that the Mountain Gorilla Vet Project was established, there were fewer than 300 mountain gorillas. And as Chris mentioned, there's now more than 1,000. And those threats that I mentioned, the key ones were poaching, habitat degradation. And the project has really evolved over the time since 1986 into a One Health project. And I will say also, I remember very clearly I was a freshman in college at the time, reading a very small blurb in some magazine. The name of the magazine is lost in the mists of time, but talking about how this project was going to be established to provide veterinary care for mountain gorillas. And it was absolutely unique and nothing else like it in the world at the time. And I thought, wow, that sounds like just the kind of thing I would love to do. So in the 1980s, like I mentioned, the first veterinarians that undertook this work were really figuring out how to provide individual care and emergency response to mountain gorillas in the wild. All veterinary care is provided to the gorillas in the wild. They're never captured and brought into even temporary captivity. So everything is done on the side of the mountain in the midst of the gorilla group with people who understand gorilla behavior very well, helping to run those interventions so that everybody is safe, both the humans and the gorillas. There was also a respiratory disease outbreak, a measles-like outbreak in the gorillas in the early 80s, and vaccination of individual animals was undertaken using human measles vaccine, which was credited with stopping that that outbreak as it was happening and saving untold lives as far as the number of gorillas that were saved with that action. In the 1990s, the veterinarians working with the Mountain Gorilla Vet Project refined those protocols that were developed using new and improved anesthesia methods and undertaking research looking at parasites that were shared, gastrointestinal parasites and skin parasites that were shared between gorillas, domestic animals, and also humans. In the 2000s, I'll come back to this. This is the time that Chris and I worked there from roughly 2000 to 2006. And I'll come back and talk about the work that we did. 2010s, there was really a lot of expansion of work and growth of the One Health Project to look at infectious disease research in a variety of different species, both domestic and wild, and including humans, to understand this ecosystem in which the gorillas were living and how to improve the health for all, depending upon that ecosystem. There was a development of a program to bring human medical residents to help improve the medical care in the human communities, continuing expansion of the work with the eastern gorillas. As Chris mentioned, there's two different species, and eastern lowland or eastern gorillas, Growers gorillas, and mountain gorillas are part of that eastern gorilla group. And then continued development of country expert leadership. And now in the sort of new 2020 era, the project's really led in country by country national experts. So I'll talk a little bit more about this work that we did, standardizing gorilla health surveillance, developing an employee health program, orphan gorilla care, livestock health projects, and really promoting and helping to train the first generation of country national experts to provide this care. So this is a couple of pictures of some interventions that were done fairly early on when Dr. Whittier and I started working with the Mountain Gorilla Vet Project. On the left, you'll see two veterinarians. It's myself and Dr. Innocent Rowego and Dr. Bernard Zebedee, both Ugandan veterinarians. And on the right is Chris. I think that's an intervention in Congo. You can either nod if you remember or say no. No, it's not Congo. I don't remember. But that's sort of what interventions look like at that time.
I would just point out for the record that this is before we had very much stricter protocols about our own PPE. So I should actually be in long sleeves in that picture.
Yep.
We're much better about that now.
I want to talk a little bit about another one of Diane's lasting legacies, which was the development of ecotourism to support gorilla conservation. It's an idea that she and others involved in gorilla conservation developed, and they were widely reviled for that. You can't, animals that need to be conserved need to be left alone. They have to be in these protected areas. Even though safaris, right, and going on safari in a car to see large hoofstock, rhinos and elephants and lions and other things was part of what people did. The idea that people would undertake this fairly grueling physical hike. You can't drive up to a mountain gorilla group to view them. It's a tough habitat. There's stinging nettles. It's often rainy and muddy, and it can be really hard to get to where the gorillas are. She was just told it was never going to work. But like many other things, Diane persisted nevertheless. And the ecotourism revenues from gorilla tourism in all three mountain gorilla range countries have really proven to be the key to saving mountain gorillas. And that revenue funds not only the national parks in which the mountain gorillas are found, but activities in national parks in all of the other three countries, the other park systems, and also supports improved access to healthcare and schools and jobs in the local communities. But along with all of those positive benefits, there are risks or cons, downsides to that tourism. And one of those is the fact that tourism means that people from all over the world can travel on a long haul international flight, and within 24 to 48 hours of leaving home, they can be standing in front of wild mountain gorillas. Okay, and there are rules in place to protect the gorillas. We are supposed to maintain a distance of 7 meters. That's about 21 to 23 feet away from the gorillas. The humans know and in large part do their best to respect that distance, helped by the national parks guides that are guiding them to see the gorillas, but the gorillas don't know anything about that distance and they are curious. And also sometimes the habitat is such that there's limited places to move. So you will see pictures like those or videos like those on the left posted on social media sites. And seeing those kinds of close physical encounters, and we've all probably seen pictures of Dian Fossey also in the early days when she was habituating gorillas, being close to gorillas like that, touching them and holding them and rolling around and playing with them. Things have evolved and we understand that that is really not appropriate and that carries risks for the humans because they're big animals that are very strong and can be dangerous, but also for the gorillas because of the potential to transfer infectious diseases. And it's not just the tourists, it's researchers as well. Okay, so people that are continuing the behavioral research of Dian Fossey. And I always own myself in this presentation because it happened to me. This is a photograph of literally my very first day with mountain gorillas. I remember it well. And I sat down and this very curious, she was about 5-6 years old, female gorilla came over and decided she was interested to find out about this new person. And so despite knowing everything that I know and doing the best to maintain that distance, it happens to everyone. But here's some of the dangers. We know that our respiratory diseases, human origin pathogens, can be shared very easily with mountain gorillas and other great apes, such as chimpanzees, that you can also visit during ecotourism programs. So a range of different viral pathogens, and there's a lot of names here which we don't have to go through, but we know that those can be transmitted to mountain gorillas and have and other great apes and actually cause infectious disease outbreaks and deaths and linked to population declines, one of the contributing factors. And so this is another sort of soapbox issue for me and for Dr. Whittier as well, is that pathogens do not know directions. So we talk a lot, and especially during this pandemic, and with influenzas as well, avian influenza, we talk a lot about the risk of pathogens being transmitted from animals, wild and domestic animals, to humans. And we forget to think about the fact that those pathogens don't know directions, okay? That we can just as easily share pathogens back to domestic animals and wildlife. And we know from an outbreak at the San Jose Zoo, in January of this year, that gorillas are susceptible to SARS-CoV-2. So we have to do everything possible to protect them during the normal research activities and the continued ecotourism, which is absolutely essential to protecting gorillas and their continued conservation success story. So just like I mentioned, pathogens being shared between humans and other animals, they can be shared between different species of animals, okay? So gorillas do still leave the park borders. Like I said, there's not some sort of force field that keeps them in. And sometimes domestic animals do stray into the national park as well. So this is a lava rock wall that was built just as a demarcation of the national park border. Gorillas can cross it. Other wild and domestic animals can cross it. And so there is mingling of wild and domestic species, which creates health risks as well. And so starting in the early 2000s, the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project worked to develop a gorilla health surveillance program that were standardized in all 3 countries, in all of the national park systems in which gorillas are found. And that's an incredible achievement and an incredible amount of work to pull off. And so this is some screenshots from the early days when we were using some of the first handheld tablet computers to collect information. So there was a computer-based version and also a paper-based version that was completed both by veterinarians and the national parks rangers that were visiting gorillas every day. And the system's called IMPACT. It's an acronym. It's still being used. It's evolved over time. And it's really a wonderful system for being able to provide standardized data collection and sharing across countries and to enable rapid response to any health concerns that are seen. And part of that linked to that surveillance system, the data collection, was this multi-year, thousands of hours of work, again, across 3 different countries, 3 different national park systems, to develop this decision tree to decide what to do when health problems are detected in the gorillas, whether it's a single gorilla or something in a group of gorillas. And this agreement was reached between multiple countries. Like I said, it took thousands of hours, and this chart really summarizes thousands of hours of work. It seems pretty simple, but it really helps get everybody on the same page to figure out what are we going to do if there's gorillas that are sick, if there's gorillas that are injured. And the summary is that if it is natural, if it's an injury due to natural gorilla behavior, because silverback gorillas fight. Gorilla groups sometimes encounter each other, and there can be a lot of aggression and activities that result in injuries. But if it's natural gorilla behavior, the general response is that it's left alone because we don't want to interfere with natural behavior. But it's something that is human-induced or life-threatening triggers a response from the veterinarians to make an assessment and then decide if a treatment is warranted. And so, as I mentioned, the Gorilla Doctors One Health program has continued to grow. And in addition to those core activities of monitoring the health of gorillas and responding to injury or illness, post-mortem exams are collected if gorillas die. Biological samples are banked to be stored over time to enable researchers to ask questions and have samples to be able to ask and answer those questions. Emerging infectious disease research. So there are cave systems within these national parks, and part of the work done over the last decade or so is looking at what pathogens might there be in bats and other wildlife in the park that can be a risk to gorillas and also to humans. And then human-gorilla conflict. As the gorilla population grows, the young male gorillas and others explore the area more. And there were some pretty high-profile examples of, this is a young silverback gorilla who had left his group and ranged outside the national park in DRC several different times and actually had to be anesthetized and transported back into the park. And you can see that he's coming into close contact proximity with huge groups of interested community members, many of which have never seen a gorilla before, or certainly not a silverback that close. I mentioned the medical resident program in improving healthcare for people in the communities around the national park systems. The Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project developed and started while Chris and I were there, a gorilla conservation employee health program. So making sure that the people who are living and working with gorillas all the time are as healthy as they can be. That helps to decrease the risk of disease transmission to the gorillas. And also it's just a good thing to make sure that your employees have access to good health care. And then also taking care of the domestic animals. So vaccinating domestic dogs and cats for rabies and doing livestock health research on the cattle, sheep, and goats that range around the perimeter of the park system. The other side of excellent conservation and enforcement of national biodiversity protection laws is the confiscation of poached wildlife. And so national authorities, by and large, in just about any country, including ours, do not prioritize sort of forward planning for the care, and often long-term care is required for poached animals. So when Chris and I started working with the Mountain Gorilla Vet Project in the 2000s, there were no confiscated animals in the care of MGVP or the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund or the conservation partners in this area of the country. By the time we finished our work, here's some of the photos of the primates that had been confiscated from illegal activities and people who were holding them illegally and kind of remanded to our care, usually with very little warning. And sort of no budget, no plan, no facilities. So this was a huge part of the work that happened that was not actually officially part of our work. It wasn't previewed. There wasn't a budget for it. We had to come up with somebody to provide the care. It was us and our colleagues initially. We had to fund it. We had to come up with standard procedures for doing this. We had to figure out physical facilities for doing this. And it's something that is absolutely necessary. And continues to this day. So I've put the logos up for two different conservation organizations. One's called GRACE, Gorilla Rehabilitation and Conservation Education Center. That's for the eastern or Growers gorillas that were confiscated. And the other is the Sinqueque Center of the Virunga National Park, also in eastern DRC. The chimpanzees and the monkeys that you see there were transferred to appropriate facilities, eventually transferred to appropriate facilities for their long-term care. And some of these photos from some of these gorillas that we worked with and from people that we helped to train to take care of confiscated orphan gorillas have gone viral. So there's just a couple of those photos. One of a mountain gorilla on the left at Sinqueque Center, and I think that's also from the Sinqueque Center on the right as well, but you'll see the gorilla doctor's shirt that the caregiver on the right is wearing. So you might have seen those photos. Capacity building was also a huge part of the work that we did. And when Chris and I were there, we hired these veterinarians and locally trained. They went to veterinary schools in their respective countries, and we helped train them from their experience working with livestock and a little with domestic dogs and cats to working with critically endangered mountain gorillas. Dr. Iyanya and Kambale, John Felix Kinani, and Bernard Sebede. And Dr. Iyanya just retired. This is the current cast of the head veterinarians for each country, and each of the range countries now has multiple veterinarians employed in different roles. It's really cool for us to see Dr. Sebede and Dr. Eddie Kambale Sialua kind of grow and continue in their roles as leaders in their respective countries in mountain gorilla conservation and education, and they're the country experts that they should be. So thinking back to those original sort of early intervention photos where we were there as the leading experts to help share our knowledge and train people. This is what interventions and snare removals look like now. It is all led by country national experts, which is wonderful. That's as it should be. There's still work to be done to sort of diversify the gender equity and inclusion, but that's a long-term process. It's ongoing. The last point I want to make is that there was a summary and evaluation of this work that was done in 2011 and published, and it was defined as extreme conservation. And you'll see myself and Tara Stowinski as co-authors on this paper. Extreme conservation was defined as efforts targeted to deliberately increase positive human influences, including veterinary care and close monitoring of individual animals. And so using both actual data and some modeling, there was the growth rate of the population was evaluated under different scenarios, and including veterinary interventions and the impact of those veterinary interventions essentially doubled the population growth rate, which is pretty cool to be able to say that this project, which was thought to be just another crazy dream of Dian Fossey's, over time has really contributed to the incredible growth of the mountain gorilla population. And that growth was sort of noted by the IUCN in 2018, that mountain gorillas are recovering. They're the only population of great apes that are growing right now. And it is a massive team effort, and it's a marathon relay race. So while some of those old familiar threats still exist, there are new ones that have to be countered at all times. And one of the new ones is onshore oil and gas exploration and extraction. So all along this Albertine Rift region of Congo and Uganda. That was highlighted in the film Virunga, which some of you may have seen. It's available for streaming online, and it's well worth watching. I use it for teaching every year. And this is just the logos of some of the organizations that have been involved in mountain gorilla conservation over the long term. So back to Chris for the wrap up.
Okay, so we just wanted to end with, talking for a few minutes about all the things that we can all be doing to contribute to conservation, of gorillas. And so I think it's pretty easy for us to sit back and think, this is the other side of the world. There's not really a lot that we can do now, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples or things to think about. And so the first, oops, lost pace there, sorry. The first is kind of recognizing that part of what's driving some of the poaching of animals like chimpanzees and gorillas is this notion about them making good pets. And this is fed into by the entertainment industry, particularly in the United States. And so this is something that, we sort of encourage people to be aware of and to be not very tolerant of, because this is part of what contributes to this idea that, we particularly as Americans or Westerners, are, like to have these animals as pets. And that's a lot of what sort of drives the illegal pet trade. The second thing is again, hopefully preaching to the choir with most of you, but just thinking about the resources that we consume. And again, it's hard to think about, things that go into your recycling bin here in the US and how that's going to contribute to gorilla conservation. But I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of that. So the first one actually isn't about recycling, but should be aware that many of us are familiar with sort of the notion of blood diamonds and the fact that diamonds are an extractive resource, many of which come from Africa, many of which actually come from places where there is illegal mining, including in the mountain gorilla habitat and particularly the eastern gorilla habitat. And so that's just something to be thinking about in terms of one of the resources that we value and how that contributes to African wildlife conservation or the lack thereof. The other really big one and the important one has to do with the mineral that's mentioned in the title of this article, which is coltan. And if I asked any of you what that was, if you don't know, I can rest assured that probably at least 90% of you have some coltan either in your pocket or within arm's reach, because coltan is one of these precious metals that's really important for electronics because it conducts really well and it doesn't heat up. And a lot of coltan has historically been illegally mined throughout the eastern gorilla habitat, and a big contributor to their plight. And that's partly because you've got illegal mines, you've got people working in the forest, they need to eat, they're cutting down trees, they're polluting waterways and doing this sort of illegally mining in order to feed the industry that we are consumers of. And so one of the things that we can do about that is making sure that we're better about recycling our phones. And I'm sure that many of you, like me, are guilty of having an old phone that's sitting in a drawer somewhere that should have been recycled. And just the last example I'll give is thinking about sort of tropical hardwoods. And so, many of us, may not think about where wood that we buy comes from. And again, this is an industry that's starting to be a little bit regulated, but a lot of these, old growth trees are things that are cut down in habitat for gorillas and other animals in Africa that are really contributing to their plight and the loss of habitat for those animals. So, I want to thank everybody for participating today. We've got some time for some questions. There's contact information and some social media contacts for Felicia and I, but we're happy to take some questions.
Okay, well, great. Thank you both so much. One of the things I didn't really think about that I'm glad you pointed out was the idea of keeping the people working with the gorillas healthy, as well as the rabies vaccination efforts for the animals around. I think it's something that when you get fully focused on one thing, you might miss some of those other connections. One question we got when Felicia first started talking was about Dian Fossey and getting authorization into the parks. And I think that there's a lot of interest in her life, obviously. And I'm just wondering if you knew anything more about that, and if I think she encountered some resistance as well to her work.
Yeah, so there's a lot of biographical information available about Dian. A lot of authors have written about her because she's a pretty compelling figure. But she did have authorization to work in the park, and she did encounter resistance. Some of what's written about her talk about her methods as maybe not the most sensitive, not the most appropriate, that it ended up creating a lot of conflict. And many people may know that she was killed. She was murdered. And, there's various speculation about who the perpetrator might have been and the reasons for that. But, she was definitely a figure, and her methods did create a lot of conflict. And, there were better methods that she might have used, and we still have mountain gorillas to this day because of her efforts. So we can look back and learn a lot, both pros and cons, things that might have been done better, as well as still celebrating her successes.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. While we're waiting for a couple more questions to come in, I just had a question about the gorillas at the zoo who caught COVID. Do you know if they were okay?
My understanding is that if any that were symptomatic, it was very mild, and so
Okay.
they were all vaccinated, and this has actually started a much sort of broader dialogue, amongst various zoos that are vaccinating many of their animals, and so this it's actually a nice kind of advancement to see. And I think that people, by and large, starting to recognize a little bit better, the risk that, we as people pose to other animals by being able to spread disease, because obviously the gorillas got COVID from the people that were working with them. And likewise, the same with the tigers and lions at the Bronx Zoo and other wildlife everywhere. I mean, people may be familiar with the mink farms. There's been these devastating outbreaks in mink farms around the world. And again, that's because people have brought it into the mink, and they're very susceptible.
Great, thank you. Here's one. Do you have any favorite gorillas? Do you keep in touch with your gorillas? I guess.
Well, we obviously keep track of particularly of the orphans, the ones that we were helping to take care of when they were first with us. And we, I usually try not to acknowledge favorites, but there are always a couple of gorillas that sort of stick in our mind. And I was just looking up yesterday, I started to do an Instagram post, but there is a a pretty famous male in Rwanda who is now believed to be over 50 years old. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not somebody actually lost track and may have misidentified him early on, as opposed to another. But he remains one of my favorites. His name is Guhanda, and he's quite famous.
That's great. There is one that just came in, Felicia, I think for you. Do gorillas adopt young gorillas outside their group?
That's a great question, and the short answer is no. The short answer is no. They don't adopt unknown gorillas from outside the group, and gorillas dependent young whose mothers die for whatever reason, either poaching or illness, do not tend to survive. And there have been attempts with confiscated orphan gorillas to reintroduce those gorillas to the wild. We were involved with some of those, or one of those early during our tenure with MGVP. And it's difficult because of gorilla behavior. So there have been discussions about trying to keep confiscated gorillas in appropriate rehabilitation centers until they're older, because female gorillas and male gorillas will transfer between groups once they're slightly older. And either trying to replicate that natural behavior or reintroduce an entire group of gorillas, a small group of gorillas, to the wild. So do you have anything to add, Chris, to that? Yeah.
No, I think that's the simple explanation.
Yeah.
Great. This is a really important one in light of the ecotourism efforts, which have done some good too, but does habituating them interfere with their natural behaviors?
And the short answer to that is yes. And so both the process of habituation, which is particularly stressful to them, as well as the sort of long-term being habituated. And so this is, something that I think is often kind of classified as a necessary evil, because in a perfect world, it would be nice not to disturb them at all and to sort of leave them to be. But in order to be able to provide the veterinary care and do the monitoring and remove snares, and things like that, it's very helpful for them to be habituated. And the habituation process is, normally, if you went on into the forest to try to find gorillas, they would be long gone before you'd get anywhere near them. You might be able to smell them. And so the process of habituation is actually just, trying to do that day after day. And luckily they can be tracked relatively easily in most of their habitat. But when I've been interacted with gorillas that were in the process of being habituated, it's obviously very stressful to them, because the males will charge and make very clear that you're not welcome there. And essentially, it's just the endurance of people habituating them that sort of slowly wears that down, so that they ultimately become comfortable.
Interesting. Here's an important one. Where does the funding mainly come from?
Yeah, the funding for gorilla conservation comes from ecotourism revenues. So as I mentioned, it probably went pretty quickly. The funding from ecotourism revenues in Rwanda and Uganda for sure help. There's more than the gorilla parks need, and so there is actually additional revenue that helps support other national parks in the countries. So the funding comes from, there are some allocations from the central governments, but really it comes from ecotourism revenues. And the downside of that is if there's any drop in ecotourism, that was seen after the 2008 sort of financial crisis, and now with COVID, that impacts the money available for gorilla conservation.
Actually, that's really.
Sorry, Chris. To add to that, it also means that there's a lot of incentive for the host governments to be doing more visits. And so, there's a constant pressure for some of the governments to say, well, if people are visiting once a day, what about twice a day or 3 times a day or 4 times a day? And so part of, one of the things that's been looked at over the years is actually the impact once they are habituated, what is the impact on their behavior by people being there at all? And I just want to make one distinction here in terms of the funding. So there is that funding stream that goes to the host governments from the tourism, but, the non-profit organizations like the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund and the Gorilla Doctors, are obviously funded separately. So the money for those organizations generally comes from, sometimes from grants, but it's mostly donor-generated money coming from people that are willing to give to those organizations, like similar to the World Wildlife Fund or anything like that.
Yeah. And for the first, from 1986 till 2006, the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project was funded 100% by Morris Animal Foundation. So.
Actually, that segues into just something I was going to say too, because I know about those gorilla permits and how expensive they are. And I think that they have been limiting them. So, I guess for the people who do want to go, it's good to know that the money is actually directly going, like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Going towards that. We do have a few more questions, and I know we're coming up against time, but I just want to go for a couple more. I think we can be pretty quick. I don't want to take up everyone's time, but I actually like this question because I think I know the answer to it, and I think we can send it over to Chris. And has Ebola vaccination been introduced to wild gorillas?
The short answer to that is not yet. So this has been a bit of a 10-year odyssey that I've been involved with and have laid some of the groundwork for. But to make a long story short, there's been a lot of concern about just because when you talk about Ebola, there's a lot of concern about the virus in general, and vaccination obviously rises to that level. And that's a little bit of why I was expressing some optimism or being glad of the fact that at least among zoos now there's increased recognition for how protecting gorillas from COVID is actually something that's potentially beneficial to them. And so likewise, at least in theory, there are a lot of logistics and things that would need to be overcome, but at least in theory, there are good Ebola vaccines that could be used and could be applied at least to habituated gorillas at the current time. But there's a lot of remains unknown about duration of immunity and things like that.
Yeah, and I would imagine, given the shortage of COVID vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa right now, there hasn't been talk yet of vaccinating them against COVID.
I'm actually not sure. It could. I wouldn't be surprised if there had been some discussion, because there's been discussion from time to time about things like gorillas and zoos are given a flu vaccine every year, for the most part. The problem is that with a couple of hundred mountain gorillas that would all need to be darted, it's not a simple thing, and so that's part of the challenge with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just a couple more, and we can save these and maybe include them in the follow-up email to folks. But I do see this one at the government level. How well are the three countries working with each other, and to what degree is that cooperation important to the health of the gorillas?
I can't remember if I'm muted. Okay, it's that they work together very well at the level of the national park system, and it's an interesting study for three countries that have an often complicated and tense history among them. That at the ground level, at the level of the collaboration amongst the national park systems, it works very well, and it's absolutely essential, because if you remember the map Chris showed, there's 4 different national parks, but really 3 of them are one shared ecosystem that just cross a porous border. And there's everything from joint ranger patrols that will go, the rangers from 3 different countries will meet up and share patrol for anti-poaching work, across the countries, and just having that good communication. The collaboration for the censuses that happen. So mountain gorilla populations, the numbers are so well known because there's an effort, I think it's approximately every 5 years, to do an actual census. It's a coordinated effort to sweep from west to east across that tri-national park system and count gorillas. And so it's just everything that the countries do to work together. It's been officially codified into the Virunga Transboundary Conservation Alliance. I'll get the name wrong. I put the logo in the last slide, but there's an actual official body that oversees that coordination amongst the countries.
Great, thank you. I'm afraid we probably are going to have to wrap this up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to keep people too long,
Yeah.
But just a real quick, one quick little soundbite. What is the most common misperception about gorillas?
I think for me that it's probably that they're ferocious. And so obviously, there's this sort of King Kong myth, I think, tends to endure a little bit. And so, I always point out that gorillas are potentially dangerous. I mean, these are big animals, they've got big teeth, and they like to defend themselves. But generally, and they also have a very strong sense of body space and don't like people getting too close and those sorts of things. But by and large, they are generally, pretty peaceful animals. And so I think, references to them as the gentle giants of the primate world, I think, are pretty accurate.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Well, thank you both so much for your time, and as you always do, making yourself available to the alumni and the broader community. You're always generous about it. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. Please be well, and hope you can join us for another program in the future. And just think of us as our virtual applause right now. And I wish everyone a great day and a good weekend. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Bye.